On the night of December 31st, 1985, Ricky Nelson boarded a plane bound for Texas, unaware that it would be the final flight of his life. Shortly afterward, a horrific plane crash claimed his life at the age of 45. The sudden death of Ricky Nelson, once hailed as a teen idol and famous from a very young age through the family sitcom The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, left millions of fans shocked and heartbroken. But what really happened on that fateful flight? Was the plane purchased or rented? The aircraft had already experienced problems before. At one point, its engine failed to start. On another occasion, a flight had to be canceled because of mechanical issues. And if the plane had already shown signs of trouble, why did that fateful flight go ahead? Did Ricky know about the risks surrounding the aircraft? Or did no one imagine that those earlier mechanical problems could eventually lead to such a tragedy? Then, after the crash, an even more shocking rumor began to spread. Many believed that a powerful and wealthy...
It was claimed that Ricky and members of his band had been using cocaine on the plane, and that this may have been connected to the fire that caused the crash. But where did this rumor actually come from? Was there really cocaine on board? Or was this simply a story that emerged in the aftermath of a famous star's sudden death? And there was another disturbing question. The two pilots survived. Yet Ricky Nelson and 6 other people aboard the plane did not. So what exactly happened inside the cabin? Why were the people in the back unable to escape in time? In the aftermath of the tragedy, a series of unanswered questions began to emerge. But to find the answers, we have to go back long before that fateful night. To a young boy whom all of America would watch grow up. Ricky Nelson. Part 1. The boy born into the spotlight. Before Ricky Nelson became a teenage heartthrob, a chart-topping singer, and one of the most recognizable young stars in America, he was simply a quiet boy growing up in a famous show business family. Ricky Nelson was born in 1940, the younger son of entertainers Ozzie and Harriet Nelson. Unlike most children, Ricky's childhood unfolded under the eyes of a nation. His parents were already established in the entertainment industry, and their family life would eventually become the foundation of one of America's most beloved television sitcoms, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. For Ricky, however, being born into a famous family did not necessarily mean that he was eager for fame. By many accounts, he was a shy, quiet, and somewhat reserved boy. He was not the kind of child who constantly demanded attention or dreamed of becoming a celebrity. Yet the world around him was already moving in that direction. When The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet became a television success, Ricky grew up in front of millions of viewers. The audience watched him change from a child into a teenager, season after season. To them, he was not simply Ozzie and Harriet's son. He gradually became a familiar part of their own lives. That was the strange power of television in the 1950s. Americans invited Ricky Nelson into their living rooms every week. They watched him grow older, listened to him speak, and eventually became fascinated by the young man he was becoming. And behind the scenes, his father, Ozzie Nelson, played an enormous role in shaping his future. Ozzie was not only Ricky's father, he was also an entertainer, a band leader, and a man who understood the business of show business. He recognized opportunities that Ricky himself might never have pursued. As Ricky grew older, his father's expectations for him also grew. The boy who had never seemed desperate for attention was slowly being transformed into someone the public could not stop watching. This was the beginning of Ricky Nelson's greatest opportunity, and perhaps the beginning of a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. Because the audience had already decided who Ricky was supposed to be. They saw the handsome, quiet son on television. They saw a teenager growing up before their eyes. And soon, they would see something more. A young man who could sing, perform, and make millions of people fall in love with his image. Ricky Nelson did not set out to become a teenage idol. America chose that destiny for him.
Part 2. From child actor to a musical sensation, Ricky Nelson had already grown up in front of millions of television viewers. But as he entered his teenage years, something unexpected began to happen. He discovered music. Ricky began learning to play the guitar and drums, and he quickly became fascinated by the new sound sweeping across America: rock and roll. Like countless teenagers of his generation, he was captivated by the energy of artists such as Elvis Presley. But for Ricky, music was more than something he listened to. It offered him a way to become someone beyond the quiet sun audiences knew from television. Then, at just 16, Ricky experienced a frightening moment that could easily have changed the course of his young life. He was involved in a Porsche accident. The incident became one of the defining episodes of his teenage years and served as a reminder that the life of a young celebrity could be far more complicated than it appeared on television. But Ricky was not going to remain only a television actor. His father, Ozzie Nelson, recognized the potential in his son's growing interest in music. With Ozzie's guidance, Ricky was given an opportunity to enter the recording business. At first, few people could have predicted what would happen next. Ricky recorded "I'm Walkin'," a song that unexpectedly exploded in popularity. Almost overnight, the quiet teenager from The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet was becoming something entirely different: a genuine recording star. The reaction from young fans was extraordinary. At concerts and public appearances, teenage girls screamed when Ricky appeared. His good looks, calm personality, television fame, and growing musical reputation created a combination that was almost impossible to resist. But there was something particularly unusual about Ricky's rise. He had not spent years trying to build himself as a rock and roll celebrity. The audience already knew him. They had watched him grow up on television, and now they were watching him transform into a young musician. That familiarity made his popularity even more powerful. Ricky quickly became one of the most recognizable faces of the emerging teen idol era. His records were reaching young listeners across America, while his television presence gave him an enormous advantage over many other new singers. For Ricky, however, this sudden fame came with a complicated reality. The public had already created an image of him before he had fully discovered who he wanted to become. To millions of fans, he was the handsome, quiet boy from television who could now sing. To the music industry, he was a valuable young star. And to his father, he was a son whose career had enormous potential. But Ricky was still only a teenager. He had gone from learning guitar and listening to Elvis Presley to hearing thousands of girls scream his name in a remarkably short period of time. The boy who had never actively chased the spotlight had suddenly become one of America's biggest teen idols. And this was only the beginning. Because the fame that made Ricky Nelson a star would eventually create a problem he could not simply sing his way out of. How could he convince America to stop seeing him as a teenage idol and start seeing him as a serious artist? Part 3. At the height of fame, Ricky Nelson, the teen idol America couldn't get enough of. By the end of the 1950s, Ricky Nelson was no longer simply the quiet teenager audiences had watched grow up on television. He had become a phenomenon. Every week, millions of Americans tuned in to The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, watching Ricky play a version of himself. His face was familiar, his voice was familiar, and now his music was becoming just as recognizable. One successful song followed another. Ricky's singles climbed the charts, while his albums reached an ever-growing audience. Songs such as Poor Little Fool, Lonesome Town, and Travelin' Man helped establish him as one of the biggest young recording stars of his generation. But Ricky's appeal went beyond the music. He had something that many other rock and roll performers of the era did not: an image of calmness and restraint. While some rock stars built their reputations around wild performances and rebellious personalities, Ricky often appeared quiet, handsome, and almost effortlessly cool. That contrast made him even more attractive to his young fans. He didn't have to shout to command attention. He didn't need to behave outrageously to become famous. Sometimes, simply walking onto a stage was enough to send crowds of teenage girls into screams. And then came Hollywood. In 1959, Ricky appeared in Rio Bravo, the classic Western starring major Hollywood figures including John Wayne and Dean Martin. The film gave Ricky the opportunity to demonstrate that he was more than a television teenager or a pop singer. For someone still so young, his career seemed almost impossibly successful. Television, music, Hollywood. Millions of fans, chart-topping records. By conventional standards, Ricky Nelson had everything a young performer could possibly want. But there was a hidden problem beneath all that success. Everyone seemed to know Ricky Nelson, except Ricky himself. The public had watched him grow up, but that also meant they had formed a very specific image of him. To many fans, he would always be the handsome teenage boy from Ozzie and Harriet. They wanted the familiar Ricky. They wanted the songs they knew. They wanted the young idol they had fallen in love with. But Ricky was growing older. His musical tastes were changing, his ambitions were changing. And somewhere beneath the carefully maintained image of the perfect young star was a young man who was beginning to wonder whether the life everyone admired was actually the life he wanted. This was the paradox of Ricky Nelson's success. The more America loved the image of Ricky Nelson, the harder it became for Ricky to simply be himself. He had been given fame before he was old enough to fully understand what fame meant. Now, as an adult, he would have to make one of the most difficult choices of his career. Remain the Ricky Nelson America already knew, or risk disappointing millions of people in order to become the artist he wanted to be. Part 4. When the teen idol began trying to escape his own image, but growing older presented Ricky Nelson with a problem that success could not solve. America had fallen in love with the young Ricky Nelson from the adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. But Ricky was no longer that teenager. He was becoming an adult, and he no longer wanted to spend the rest of his life playing the same role that had made him famous. At the age of 21, he began using the name Rick Nelson rather than Ricky Nelson. A small change on the surface, but one that reflected something much deeper. He wanted people to see the man behind the teenage image. And he wanted to be taken seriously as a musician. Instead of simply repeating the formula that had made him a teen idol, Rick began moving in a different musical direction. He embraced country rock and formed the Stone Canyon Band, developing a sound that was more mature and closer to the kind of music he genuinely wanted to make. This period of Rick Nelson's career is often overshadowed by the fame of his teenage years, but it may have been one of the most important chapters of his entire life. For the first time, Rick was making a deliberate attempt to define himself. The problem was that his audience did not necessarily want him to change. Many of the fans who had grown up watching him on television still wanted the old Ricky Nelson. They wanted the familiar songs. They wanted the handsome teenage idol they remembered. Rick, however, wanted something different. He wanted to be respected as an adult artist. That conflict eventually reached a painful moment at Madison Square Garden. Rick appeared before an audience expecting to perform the music he had chosen to embrace. But the crowd had expectations of its own. They wanted the old hits and the familiar Ricky Nelson they remembered. Instead, they encountered an older artist performing a different kind of music. The reaction was bitter. For Rick, the experience was more than just one disappointing concert. It represented the larger problem he had been struggling with for years. The audience loved Ricky Nelson, but were they willing to accept Rick Nelson? That question stayed with him, and eventually the experience inspired one of the most important songs of his career, Garden Party. The song became much more than a reflection on one difficult evening. It captured Rick's frustration with an audience that seemed unwilling to accept the person he had become. But there was also something defiant about it. Rick was no longer begging people to accept him. He was essentially saying that he could not spend the rest of his life trying to satisfy everyone.
The boy America had once created was finally trying to reclaim his own identity. And that makes the story of Rick Nelson far more complicated than the story of a fallen teen idol. He had not simply lost his audience. He had chosen to risk losing part of it in order to become the artist he wanted to be. But that decision came with a price. As Rick moved further away from the image that had made him famous, his career, finances, and personal life would begin entering an increasingly difficult period. And the question would become even harder. What happens when the world stops rewarding you for becoming the person you finally chose to be? Part 5. Love, Marriage, and the Price of Becoming an Adult. In 1963, Ricky Nelson entered a new chapter of his life when he married Kristen "Chris" Harmon, the daughter of football star Tom Harmon and actress Elise Knox. For Ricky, marriage represented something far more significant than simply falling in love. The teenager America had watched grow up on television was now becoming a husband and eventually a father. Ricky and Chris would have 4 children together: Tracy, twins Gunnar and Matthew, and Sam. For a time, family life seemed to offer Ricky something he had never really experienced before: a world outside the demands of show business. But becoming an adult came with responsibilities that fame could not make disappear. Ricky's career was changing at the same time. The teenage audience that had once screamed his name was growing older, while Ricky himself was trying to move beyond the image that had made him famous. He was no longer simply the handsome young star from Ozzie and Harriet. He was a husband, he was a father, and he was trying to build a career on his own terms. Those changes brought new pressures. His musical direction was becoming more mature, but the commercial success of his earlier years was becoming harder to reproduce. Meanwhile, raising a family required stability, time, and money. The pressures of career and family gradually began to overlap. Financial difficulties became another source of stress. Ricky had once enjoyed enormous success, but maintaining the lifestyle associated with fame was expensive, and his professional situation was no longer as secure as it had been during his teenage years. At the same time, the marriage between Ricky and Chris became increasingly troubled. Exactly what happened inside their relationship has been debated for decades. Some later accounts and fan discussions have placed significant blame on Chris, while others have offered very different interpretations of the marriage. For that reason, it is important not to turn one side of the story into an established fact. What is clear is that the relationship eventually broke down. After nearly 2 decades together, Ricky and Chris divorced in 1982. The end of the marriage was not simply an emotional turning point, it also brought serious financial consequences for Ricky, adding another burden to a life that was already becoming increasingly complicated. And perhaps the most painful part was the timing. Ricky had spent much of his life being told who he was supposed to be, first by television audiences, then by the music industry, and now by the expectations surrounding marriage and family. He had tried to become his own man, but adulthood had not brought the freedom he imagined. Instead, it had brought new responsibilities, financial pressure, and a marriage that ultimately could not survive. Still, Ricky continued moving forward. He kept performing, he kept making music, and he refused to completely disappear, even as the spotlight that once followed him everywhere began to fade. By the early 1980s, the question was no longer whether Ricky Nelson could become famous. He already had been. The question was whether he could rebuild a life and career after the world had stopped seeing him as the teenage idol it once adored. And he would have only a few more years to find the answer. Part 6. The Final Years. A star trying to find his place again. By the early 1980s, Ricky Nelson was no longer the unstoppable teenage sensation he had once been. The screaming crowds were smaller. The chart success was harder to reproduce, and the image of the handsome young Ricky from the adventures of Ozzie and Harriet belonged increasingly to another era.
But Ricky had not simply disappeared. He continued performing, traveling from one venue to another and keeping his music alive. He also made appearances on television and other programs, continuing to look for opportunities to reconnect with audiences who had once followed him everywhere. It would be easy to describe this period by saying that Ricky had become a washed-up star. But that description misses something important. Ricky was still an artist. He was still performing. He was still creating music. And he still had people who wanted to hear him. The problem was that the enormous audience he once had was no longer guaranteed. This created a painful contrast between the Ricky Nelson of the past and the man standing on stage in the 1980s. There had been a time when simply appearing in public could cause crowds of teenagers to scream. Now, Ricky had to work for the attention. He had to travel. He had to perform. He had to rebuild his relationship with an audience that had changed just as much as he had. And yet, there were moments when it seemed that a comeback might still be possible. His music had never completely lost its appeal, and songs such as Garden Party proved that Ricky could still connect with listeners when he was allowed to present himself as the artist he had become rather than the teenage idol he once was. That distinction mattered. Ricky was no longer trying to recreate the 1950s. He was trying to find a place for himself in a music industry that had moved on. But his professional struggles were only part of the story. Behind the stage lights, Ricky was also dealing with personal, financial, and emotional pressures. His marriage had ended. His finances had become more complicated. His career no longer provided the security and certainty it once had. Yet he kept going. Perhaps that determination was one of the most revealing things about Ricky's final years. He could have allowed his past to define him completely. Instead, he continued searching for another chapter. There was something almost ironic about it. The man who had once been famous simply for being Ricky Nelson now had to prove that Ricky Nelson still mattered. And perhaps that is why the final years of his life deserve more attention than they often receive. This was not simply the story of a former teen idol watching his fame disappear. It was the story of an experienced performer trying to adapt, survive, and continue doing what he loved while the world around him changed. Ricky had spent decades living under the expectations of an audience. Now, with far less attention than before, he was finally making music on his own terms. But just as he seemed to be finding a new rhythm in his life, something happened that would bring everything to an abrupt end. In December 1985, Ricky Nelson was still performing. He still had music to play, he still had places to go, and he still had a future he believed he could continue building. He had no way of knowing that the journey ahead would last only a few more days. Because before the year was over, Ricky Nelson would board one final flight. And this time, he would never come home. Part 7. The Final Night. The flight that never reached its destination. By the end of 1985, Ricky Nelson was still doing what he had done for most of his adult life, performing music. The glory days of the 1950s were long gone, but Ricky had not walked away from the stage. He was still traveling, still performing, and still trying to build the next chapter of his career. Then came December 31st, 1985. Ricky was preparing to travel to Texas for a New Year's Eve performance. He was accompanied by his girlfriend, Helen Blair, along with members of his band and crew. But there was something unsettling about the aircraft they were about to board. The plane had reportedly experienced technical problems during the tour. There had already been moments when mechanical issues caused concern, including problems involving the aircraft's engine. Yet the journey continued. And that night, Ricky boarded the plane. At the time, there was nothing to suggest that this would be the final flight of his life. There was no farewell performance, no final announcement, no dramatic goodbye to his fans. Just another journey for a musician who had spent decades traveling from one stage to another. But shortly after takeoff, something went terribly wrong. A fire broke out aboard the aircraft, and the situation rapidly became an emergency. The pilots attempted to deal with the crisis, But the aircraft ultimately crashed. The consequences were devastating. Ricky Nelson and several other people aboard the plane were killed. The two pilots survived. In a matter of minutes, a musician who had spent his entire life in front of cameras and audiences was suddenly gone. He was only 45 years old. And that is perhaps what made the news so difficult for so many people to comprehend. Ricky Nelson was not remembered as an aging star who had quietly disappeared from public life. He was someone millions of Americans had watched grow up. They had first seen him as a child on The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. They had watched him become a teenage idol. They had listened to his songs. They had watched him mature into an artist determined to escape the image of his youth. And now, suddenly, there would be no next performance. No new album. No chance to see what the next chapter of his life might have looked like. The tragedy was not simply that a famous musician had died. It was that a life that had already been lived in front of millions of people ended so unexpectedly. In the aftermath, questions began to emerge about the aircraft, the fire, and what had happened during those final moments. Rumors also began circulating, adding another layer of confusion to an already devastating tragedy. But beneath all the speculation was a much simpler and more painful reality. Ricky Nelson was gone. The boy America had watched grow up had become a man who was still searching for his place in the world. And before he could find out where that journey might lead, it was over. For decades, Ricky Nelson had lived under the spotlight. On that final night, the spotlight went out. But the questions surrounding his final flight had only just begun. Part 8. What did Ricky Nelson really leave behind? Ricky Nelson's story did not begin with a plane crash, and it should not end there either. Long before that final flight, he had already lived several remarkable lives. He was first the quiet child growing up on television. Then he became one of America's most recognizable teen idols, with millions of young fans following his every move. From there, he developed into a successful rock and roll singer and eventually moved toward country rock, searching for a sound and identity that belonged to the adult artist he had become. That journey is what makes Ricky Nelson's legacy so complicated. It would be easy to remember him simply as the handsome young star from The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, or as the singer whose life ended tragically in a plane crash. But Ricky was much more than either of those images. Over the course of his career, he sold tens of millions of records and left a lasting mark on American popular music. His early hits helped define the sound of the late 1950s and early 1960s, while his later work showed that he was unwilling to remain trapped in the musical identity that had made him famous. Perhaps the clearest example of that transformation was Garden Party. The song represented more than another successful record. It reflected Ricky's struggle with an audience that remembered the young idol he had once been, while he was desperately trying to be recognized as the musician he had become. In that sense, Garden Party became almost a statement of independence. Ricky had discovered something that many performers learn only after years in the spotlight. You cannot spend your entire life trying to satisfy everyone. Sometimes becoming yourself means disappointing the people who loved the person you used to be. That may be one of the most important reasons Ricky Nelson's music continues to resonate. His story is not simply about fame gained and fame lost. It is about transformation. He went from child actor to teen idol, from teen idol to rock and roll star, and eventually toward a country rock sound that reflected his own artistic choices. And although his life ended far too soon, his influence did not disappear with him. After his death, Ricky Nelson was eventually inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, recognizing his lasting contribution to the music that helped shape American culture. But perhaps the most interesting part of Ricky's legacy is the fact that people are still debating his life decades later. They still discuss his music. They still remember his television years. They still argue about the choices he made. They still revisit his marriage, his career, his transformation as an artist, and the circumstances surrounding his final flight. That continued discussion tells us something important. Ricky Nelson has not been forgotten. Perhaps he never will be. Because behind the famous face, behind the teenage screams, behind the television cameras and the hit records, there was a man who spent much of his life trying to answer one difficult question. Who was Ricky Nelson when he was no longer the person America expected him to be? And maybe the answer was hidden in the message of Garden Party all along. You cannot please everyone. Eventually, you have to find the courage to please yourself. Ricky Nelson once had almost everything a Hollywood boy could dream of: fame, money, success, and millions of fans. But as he grew older, he discovered that the hardest thing was not becoming a star. It was becoming himself.